Hello all, A Nice Tale here, bringing you another knife review, though today's going to be more of an overview of this Null Knives Ghoul. It's the latest model that's dropped from them, and if you want to follow Null Knives, there's everything. The website, the Instagram, etc. This is going to be more of an overview because this is not a knife that I really have used or carried all that much. For obvious reasons, this is a limited edition. It was from the first and I think only initial run of these things that they've done. And this knife is in monochrome zircuti, Vanex super clean blade, and the hardware is polished zirconium. This knife is running on bearings. It is a liner lock with a rather great access to the liner and a thick disengagement bar, so you really kind of got a great access there and great leverage on everything. This is a front flipper with great jimping all the way up and around. Can be done pretty much any way you want. You can reverse flick it from the fuller. You can even thumb flick from the fuller, but it doesn't feel... It's a little bit slippery, but you can definitely do it if you push into it a little bit. Great detent. Perfectly centered. No play. And there's a hand rub finish on this Vanex blade. Let us jump into specifications. Blade length is just under 8 1/8. Overall is 7 1/4, and this would be just over an 8 1/8 for handle length, or an 8 1/8. 8 and I don't know where I'm going. 3 1/8, 7 1/4, and 4 1/8. About. That's what we're looking at. Blade, overall, handle. I'm overcomplicating this. Let us take a quick comparison to our faithful comparison knives. The Civivi Elementum and the Civivi Conspirator. As you can see, this is basically Elementum size. It's a little bit longer, tiny bit more blade, tiny bit more handle. But it's a small knife. It does have more presence than the Elementum, but let's get that out of there. Despite its unusual shape, it's not really much taller than the Conspirator in anywhere. In fact, I'd say the Conspirator with the flipper tab is probably just as thick as down here. So it carries a bit more like a full-size knife because it's also just about as thick as the Conspirator, maybe a tiny bit thinner. So it is a smaller knife with a slightly larger presence. And you'll notice the presence in the general feel of the knife as well. This feels like a more substantial knife than it is. I think it's because you got these thick scales and it's just very solid feeling. This is not a great example for the weight of the knife because this one's got zirconium on it, so it's 4 ounces approximately. But the zirconium infused scales, the zirconium pocket clip and pivots are going to add some weight to this. I would imagine that this thing, based version in pure titanium, probably hits your ounce and inch pretty darn well. So the ratios for most of these knives are probably pretty good. Let's do a hardware check real fast. D8. T8. T8. Okay, so this thing's T8 hardware all over. And pretty minimal. It's got these two body screws and this. The pocket clip screw is hidden inside. I'm pretty sure that's a T8 as well. Which is wonderful to see. Don't like T6, and this thing, despite being a small knife, which is even more prone to having T6 on it, has none to be found. These scales are milled out inside. Oh, and if you look on this side, in my particular version, it is very hard to see on camera, but it is in there. It just doesn't want to focus on it. You've got the limited edition number. This is number 15 out of 20. You can't really see it great, but it is in there. And as you can see, the action's quite good. It readily drops. This is a pretty unused knife. I have not been carrying this thing, and probably will not be carrying this thing particularly much because it's such a limited edition and it's a bit fancy. But the action's good. Dog. He concurs. And the reason I'm not doing really a review of this knife so much as an overview is because I haven't carried this. It's not something that's going to get a heavy workout for me. At least not this one. The stop pin is right there. It is unfortunately behind the edge. There is one good thing to be said about this stop pin being there. It is slightly countered by the fact that the stop pin hits back here and the edge is lower than the stop pin. Or where it hits, I should say. So, while eventually, yeah, it could mess with the stop pin, eventually, yeah, you might want to cut in more choil, but there's a ton of material and choil to be eaten up and gone through and sharpened off before then. So it probably wouldn't be a problem. I mean, you really have to get all the way up into here before you really start worrying about that. And so you have a ton of material and a good lifespan. That is one way to get away from bad stop pin placement, but overall, I'd still love to see the stop pin be internal or just move back a little bit. Speaking of move back, the plunge grind, as you can see, it ends about here. Now, there's definitely more than enough room because you have that extra height, but I wouldn't mind seeing that being pulled back as well. I don't think that'll affect this knife too badly. You'll still get a good amount of use and life out of this knife, and I'm not going to probably ever hit all the way back because I'm not using this knife that much, but if you have a regular version, you may get there eventually. You know what? We didn't do the actual thickness of the handle. Yeah, it's about 1/2 inch. Pretty much on the dot. So it's a tiny bit thinner than the Conspirator. So yeah, this is not a particularly thick knife. The blade stock is 117 thousandths, which is a little bit odd. It's usually 115 or 120, but it's quite thin. And behind the edge should also be quite thin on this knife. I'm a little high there. 11 to 12 thousandths behind the edge. This thing is thin behind the edge. It is a reasonably tall grind for this small knife. It is a performer. It is a cutter. Any version of this knife is going to do extremely, extremely well. This particular version being in Venex is, of course, a great steel and an expensive steel, but the base version is in S90V, and that's going to be fantastic too. This is a knife that if you have the base version or you're looking to get a version of this, it's going to perform wonderfully. Even having this sort of buoy, not trailing point, but upswept tip, the tip is very accessible. You've got belly down here. You've got enough flat to push through things. It's a great blade shape with great geometry. this is a knife that can do some really good cutting. And honestly is tempting me to carry more often because of that. Yeah. Ergos. Ergos on this knife are interesting. They're really good, but you're in a slightly different position than a lot of very neutral standard pocket knives. You can get up here and put this hump behind you, and it's very comfortable. Very comfortable to squeeze down on, very comfortable for the saber grip. No problems. But it feels a little bit interesting because you're pushed up and because you have these two dropping points, basically. It's not uncomfortable. I definitely fit in here. And for your information, I have a large sized hand. My fingers are a bit stubby. I don't like that. But this is about 3.8, 3.9 inches. And it reaches up to about 4 inches, almost on the dot across here. So it's not a particularly small hand. It's not an extra large hand, but it's pretty reasonably sized. I fit in here quite well, quite comfortably. I also, when I want to pick up the knife, can wrap my finger around here for sort of a pulled back, sort of pistol grip kind of thing. Very comfortable there. You can even pull your pinky back a little bit so you're not pushing into that and just sit right on top of it. You can ride it, and it's still comfortable. But in each of these positions, because of this heavy arc and because of the presence of this, you're in a slightly different position than you might be used to with other knives. So while it's super comfortable, maybe it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's not a problem for me, though I do find myself wishing that maybe this hump didn't come out quite as much. Maybe just like cut off that and just make the arc down there so it ends up there instead of there. It'll give a little more room, give a little more neutral grip, and honestly, it's not exactly going to mess with the design element, you know. I mean, it's just so it's a little lower there. Whoop-de-doo. But despite its peculiarities and despite it being a small lure handle, it's still quite comfortable. And I mean, that's impressive. You got to give credit to the designer. They've clearly thought this thing through to try and make it so that they can have this unusual design and still make it really usable and pleasant to use. And speaking of design, it's not only striking, it is very, very attractively milled and finished. There is a lanyard hole back there, hidden and out of the way. But overall, that's what this thing does. This has got great aesthetics, or very unique aesthetics. I guess that's really one thing. It's either for you or it's not. And I think you'll find that with Null knives designs in general. They're quite interesting. The first one was a little bit plain, but it still had its quirks. The second two, I mean, technically there's 4, but one's just sort of a rebladed version of the first one. The other 2, on the other hand, were extremely interesting looking designs, and I particularly loved them. I have both this and the other design. So the guy knows how to design things, and I think he's trying to take into consideration everything that he can, which is, I appreciate. Stop pin would be one thing that I would suggest maybe making it internal. Even if you don't make it internal and you just sort of stick it into the blade somewhere, like right up in there. Your stop pin will be there, it'll hit right in front of the tang, and it'll have a hole through the blade to its next position. That would work too. But, again, I don't think it's really going to cause a problem with this one, based on how much you have to drop down below. So, I guess I'll mention that the clip on this has decent enough retention, probably a little bit better on the basic version, because this is zirconium. And is easy in and out of the pocket from what I've experienced. I've only put it in my pocket, I think, twice. This is a decently fidgety knife as well, because of the multiple methods to open. Not the most fidgety, but I suppose if you like playing with your knife, that is... Well, you'll have to like playing with your knife, plus you'll also have to like front flippers. Otherwise, you're really only using the reverse flick. So while it has elements to be a little more universally liked by most people, you won't get the fidget out of the full experience if you don't want to use the front flipper. I personally like front flippers. I know a lot of people don't. This is a really, really good one. It's really, really easy. But I have no problem with them. So, the base version of this knife, which is going to be much more attainable than this one. I think they're sold out at the moment, but Null has done several drops of each knife he's done so far. So, they've come back and been relatively snaggable, I guess, pretty frequently, but you can, of course, probably find one or two on the secondary somewhere. The base model is 325, I want to say. That is a full, like, static stonewash. It's a heavy-duty, like, gray stonewash. Most versions are at 350. There was a Damasteel version up at a couple $100 more, I think $500, and then there was this thing, which was fully decked out. Of course, this is 15 out of 20, but there was also a second special edition that had the Damasteel blade. I thought it was a bit too much to go with the handle, so I went with just the plain Vanax. But there are a lot of options out there, and he's offered a lot of options for every one of his models. So you'll probably have something you can find that you'll like. The price point is pretty reasonable for an OEM, I guess you would call that collaboration knife, with a designer out of America. And I think you're getting your money's worth. There's enough execution quality that is, I mean, that's just quite high. And there's enough detail with good materials. You have S90V on the base one and titanium. So, yeah, this is a pretty recommendable knife. It's a good performing knife. I kind of still hope he does a slightly larger version of it. But really, it comes down to, is this aesthetic for you? It was for me. I like it. So, that's really all I have to say about this. I can't really tell you how the steels hold up. I haven't sharpened or anything like that. But it is a really fun and interesting knife to take a look at. So, I'm going to end here and say thanks for watching. And if you stuck around, that's great. Maybe drop a like, subscribe, comment. What's your thought on Null Knives designs? Your experience getting your hands on one of them. Like I said, I didn't really have a trouble. I pre-ordered this thing from its initial run, but I had no real issue with getting my hands on stuff, and I know that there's been several drops of different models, so they're not the most readily available. It's not just like coming straight from a production company that they're putting out a bunch of knives for, but they've been more attainable than some, let's put it like that. And I think they're probably going to do more runs of each. that's all I have to say about this. So I'm gonna end it here. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.